In this next video for Chapter 7, we're just going to look a little bit more at the unemployment rate and some different measures that the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes. So these numbers come out every month. It's usually the first Friday of the month will give us the unemployment data for the previous month. That sometimes is different if the first of the month is on a Friday. So one of the things that we need to understand is that it's a statistic, right? It's an estimate based on a survey. So they do a good job. It's a large survey. It's 60,000 households, as we'll see. But we're not asking every single person in the economy. So usually what they do is that you'll be in the group for a number of months. And so usually it's an in-person interview the first month, although obviously in the pandemic right now, that's a little bit different. And then they'll, call you for a follow-up in future months. So they'll basically in the first month they'll make sure they know everybody in the household, their ages. They'll ask, the normal "Are you working?" type questions, and then when they follow up, they already have that information. So they're just asking about anything that's changed from the previous month. So this is done by the Current Population Survey. And then the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts the numbers together, so they'll give the labor force, employment, participation rates, earnings. So there's a lot of data in there. And actually on Jobs Day it comes from two separate surveys. So the Current Population Survey is also called the Household Survey. That gives us our unemployment rate, our participation rate, the unemployment rate, etc. And then there's an establishment survey of businesses, and that usually gives us the number of jobs that were created or destroyed in every industry that month. And so those are two. They'll usually report them at the same time, and media often will just say them both, but they come from two separate surveys. So the CPS survey is 60,000 households. And it's very valuable. They ask the same questions every month, so we can compare it across time. As I mentioned in the last video, they have started asking about discouraged workers, people who would like to be working but have not looked for work in the last 4 weeks. So we have that data going back almost 30 years. And it's what economists rely on to get a picture of the labor market. So here's the unemployment rate going back to 1948. You can see, obviously, the bars represent recessions. You can see the unemployment rate increasing in recessions. I think one of the things to notice is that these sort of post-war recessions tended to be sort of sharper and shorter than recessions now, right? We had this sort of double dip recession in the early 1980s where the unemployment rate actually got up to about 10.8%. Which was similar to the unemployment rate after the financial crisis, but we didn't quite get up to 10.8%. I think the national unemployment rate was 10%. But also, we've had some periods of very low unemployment, right? Sort of the 1990s stick out as a period of low unemployment. And actually, up until this pandemic recession, we also had fairly low unemployment. It's also interesting to note that back here in the late 1960s was a period of extremely low unemployment. And this was actually the last time we reached a high in the minimum wage. So if you adjust the minimum wage in 1968, which was $1.60 for inflation, it's actually about $12.20. That's the federal minimum wage. Now, of course, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. They're talking about increasing it up to $15, although that would be by 2025. And states, of course, and some cities have also raised their minimum wages significantly above that federal minimum. So here is sort of the two numbers that most economists will look at to get a picture of the labor market. So U3 is the blue line, and that's the unemployment rate that gets reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics every month. That was the unemployment rate that was in that graph on the previous slide. And you can see, right, if we had a big increase after the financial crisis up to about 10%. And then, of course, the pandemic was completely unprecedented, and our unemployment rate briefly touched almost 15% before coming back down. The red line is what's called U6. And so it's the unemployed plus all persons marginally attached to the labor force. That includes discouraged workers, plus total employed part-time for economic reasons. That means anybody who is working part-time but would prefer to be working full-time. It doesn't include people who are working part-time by choice. As a percent of the civilian labor force plus all marginally attached to the labor force. And so you can see this is generally higher. So in the early 2000s, while the unemployment rate was below 5%, U6 was around 8%. During the financial crisis, U6 got up to almost 17.5%, and that's a large number. That's about 1 out of every 6 workers. And then U6 actually got over 20%, 22.5% in the pandemic before coming down, and it's still fairly elevated. So if we look at these two numbers together, I think that's usually pretty helpful in terms of getting a picture of the labor market. The farther apart these two are, the less good is U3 as a measure of the labor market. And you can see in 2019 they had gotten a lot closer together than they were, say, in 2010. So as we said before, movements in and out of unemployment are usually actually pretty large. The interesting thing is that they are cyclical, right, or counter-cyclical, so that the percentage of unemployed workers finding a job, which is over here on the blue line, goes up. Now this graph is a little bit hard to read because our vertical axis on the right-hand side is inverted. So we have 34 down at the bottom and we have 16 up at the top. So when this is going up, that the percentage of unemployed workers finding a job each month is going down. And that's basically, what happened. And then the unemployment rate is normal, right? So we have our regular unemployment rate here in red. And you can see that the number of people getting out of unemployment increases when the unemployment rate is low. So, it was about 32% here in 2000 when the unemployment rate was only 4%. But it was only about 24% by 2003 when the unemployment rate was about 6%. And then in the financial crisis, right, the percentage of unemployed workers finding a job every month actually fell to about 17%, while the unemployment rate was sort of between 9 and 10%. And so this is going to be important for our macro model, with the idea that it's harder to get out of unemployment when there's a recession than when there's an expansion. And anybody who's been unemployed will tell you that that's true. When you have a strong labor market like we had in the 1990s, or even like we had in sort of the pre-financial crisis, it was much easier to find a job than in these periods of high unemployment. So if we look at the separation rate, so the monthly separation rate here is in blue, so it goes from 1% on our right-hand vertical axis to 1.9%, and then we still have the same unemployment rate in red. You can see that the separation rate will also increase as the unemployment rate increases. Now this is generally from layoffs, right? Actually what we see with quits is that quits go down in a recession when the unemployment rate is higher, and that makes perfect sense, right? Because if it's going to be harder to find a job during a recession, then you don't want to quit, but you are more likely to be laid off. And why do firms lay off workers? Well, they're laying off workers because they're not seeing that they're going to need to produce as much. And if they don't need to produce as much, then they don't need as many workers working. And so that's generally what happens in a recession. We get a lot of layoffs, the unemployment rate goes up, and then once the recession is over, firms start to hire people back once they see demand picking up. So the unemployment rate is going to be an important macroeconomic variable, both because we care about the people who are unemployed, but also because it's going to help determine how tight the labor market is and what's going on with wages. And because wages are going to impact prices, it's also going to be related to inflation. Although, as we said, in chapter 2, I think, the relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation is a lot weaker than it used to be.